from Arkansas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At this time, Mr. Chair, I'd like to recognize the Wildcat from Kentucky, Mr. Barr, for the purpose of engaging in a colloquy.
Well, I want to thank Mr. Womack, Chairman of the Financial Services and General Government Subcommittee, not only for his leadership, but his rabid support of the Razorbacks. We have a big rivalry, Kentucky and Arkansas in basketball, but in this case, we are on the same page, Mr. Speaker, because the chairman has rightly included in this year's FSGG appropriations bill my legislation, H.R. 1382, the Taking Account of Bureaucrats Spending Act, or the TABS Act, which would separate the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau from the Federal Reserve System, make it an independent agency, and subject it, importantly, to the congressional appropriations process. The TABS Act would remedy the serious constitutional defect in the structure of the CFPB as established by the Dodd-Frank Act, under which the CFPB draws its funding uniquely from the Federal Reserve instead of from Congress, like most other executive branch agencies. Specifically, Dodd-Frank delegates to the director of the CFPB the unilateral power to decide in perpetuity how much money he wants for the agency to carry out its broad and potent regulatory and enforcement powers. The director then requests such amount from the Fed, which is itself exempt from the congressional appropriations process, making it double insulated from accountability. And then the Fed is then required to provide such amount to the agency, no questions asked. This is a constitutional aberration, and it is a violation of the separation of powers. Although the total amount the director can request is capped in the law, the cap is so high that it effectively grants the CFPB director unfettered discretion over the agency's amount of funding and how it is spent. No other federal agency in the entire federal bureaucracy is funded in this manner. Indeed, there is no analog for the CFPB anywhere in the history of the U.S. executive branch. Even among self-funded agencies, the Bureau is unique. It is a perpetual, self-directed, double-insulated funding structure that goes a significant step further than that enjoyed by any other agency, again, in the history of our republic. The TABS Act would fix this, and it would bring much-needed accountability to the CFPB and uphold the Constitution's separation of powers and the exclusive grant of the appropriations power to Congress. I want to make a couple of points about the TABS Act. First, the purpose of this bill is not to repeal or undermine consumer protection laws. Rather, the purpose is to address the constitutional defect in the CFPB's funding structure. No one is objecting to the utility of some federal consumer protections, but we should also agree that the Constitution reserves to Congress the sole authority to set funding limits for the CFPB and other executive branch agencies. I note that the FY24 FSGG bill would fund the CFPB at near current levels. I would also note that H.R. 2798, the CFPB Transparency and Accountability Reform Act, which was marked up out of the Financial Services Committee on April 26th, included this bill, the TABS Act, and authorized to be appropriated from unobligated amounts contained in the Consumer Financial Civil Penalty Fund, $650 million for FY24. Again, at levels comparable to what the CFPB received from the Fed this year. So, to my friends on the other side of the aisle, you can't make the argument that we're trying to defund the agency, that we're trying to gut consumer protection laws, because we're manifestly proving we're not doing that. We're funding the agency the way it should be. This clearly demonstrates that the TABS Act is not about eliminating consumer protections or the CFPB, but it's about upholding the Constitution. It's about defending the Congress, this institution. If this bill is enacted into law, the agency would continue to operate. The only difference would be that the Congress would oversee the agency's spending in the same way it does for all other consumer protection agencies and most of the rest of the federal government. As you know, the Supreme Court recently heard the case of Community Financial Services Association of America versus CFPB, in which the agency's funding structure was challenged as violating the Constitution's separation of powers and the Appropriations Clause, which provides that, quote, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. If the Supreme Court strikes down the CFPB's funding structure, as it should in this case, this bill will ensure that the agency continues to operate. Following such a decision by the court, chaos would not ensue, as some have suggested, nor would there be great uncertainty in the marketplace about the status of consumer protection laws and regulations. On the contrary, this legislation demonstrates that Congress is prepared to assert its appropriations power to stabilize pre-existing consumer protection laws and make sure that the CFPB is funded with better and more meaningful oversight in the event that the Supreme Court strikes down the funding mechanism. The Founding Fathers wanted to make sure that the legislative branch, the people's elected representatives in Congress, make the key decisions about our government, especially how tax dollars are spent. As Madison wrote in Federalist Paper number 58, the power of the purse may in fact be regarded as the most complete and effectual weapon with which any constitution can arm the immediate representatives of the people for obtaining a redress of every grievance and for carrying into effect every just and salutary measure. This is a sound principle which in the context of the CFPB or any other executive branch agency, every member of Congress, Republican and Democrat, should defend. This is not a partisan issue. This is about defending this institution and our power of the purse. And I ask my friends on the other side of the aisle, if Congress passed legislation funding the Department of Defense or the CIA in the same manner as the CFPB is currently funded, would that be acceptable? Would we want those agencies to be completely unaccountable to our oversight? The appropriations process is the primary means by which Congress on a bipartisan basis oversees those agencies, as well as all consumer protection agencies. Now, some will say that Congress can change the CFPB's funding structure at any time, so there's really no problem with the structure. Well, this is ridiculous. This is absurd. Our Constitution does not permit elected representatives in Congress to delegate away our authority, which is textually reserved to the Congress, to some other branch of government or an executive branch official. It requires that the key decisions remain in the hands of the elected representatives of the people. Congress cannot delegate away its responsibilities without undermining the separation of powers, even if it could pass legislation to retake such responsibilities in the future. Instead, it is the Supreme Court's duty to strike down laws that violate the Constitution, even if Congress could remedy those violations. For example, the Supreme Court strikes down laws that violate the First Amendment or the Commerce Clause, even though Congress could remedy those violations. There is no reason why the same should not be true of laws that violate the Appropriations Clause. Moreover, in Celia law, the court struck down the infringement of the president's removal power over the director of the CFPB. I hope now it protects Congress's power as it did the president's power in Celia law. After all, the Supreme Court's role is not just to prevent the erosion of presidential powers, but also Congress's powers. The reason the CFPB's funding structure is so problematic is that when Congress delegates its core responsibilities away to administrative agencies, the value of each American's vote is diminished. As Congress has delegated more responsibilities and more authorities to administrative agencies, Americans have come to increasingly believe that their votes do not matter. They see that changes in Congress don't change policies set by agencies. Lack of congressional control over the CFPB creates the opportunity for special interests to capture the CFPB, who run the agency according to their own ideological vision, not according to the will of the American people. Changing the CFPB's funding structure would be an important and common sense step in restoring faith in our democracy. It's important to recognize that the structure of the CFPB is an aberration in our government. No other agency is funded by the Federal Reserve at the level set by the director of the other agency. Now, I know a lot of people have raised concerns that striking down the funding structure of the Bureau would open up the question of constitutionality of the Federal Reserve and a few other agencies that are funded through assessments or other funding streams that they incur in their operations. But the funding structure of the CFPB is unique. Unlike other agencies that may be funded by a specific source of funding that they raise in the course of their operations, Seniorage in the case of the Federal Reserve, fees on banks in the case of the comptroller of the currency, deposit insurance premiums in the case of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, tariff revenue in the case of the Customs Service. The CFPB is different. There's no analog. It determines its own funding by taking funds from the Federal Reserve. No other agency obtains its funding by taking funds in this way. Further, there is no nexus between its statutory responsibilities, consumer protection, and its funding source, the Federal Reserve. In conclusion, while there has been much debate about where to draw the constitutional line on how agencies can be funded consistent with the Appropriations Clause, the funding structure of the CFPB is one we should all agree goes too far. As with the Supreme Court determination in the Free Enterprise Fund case that double insulation on removal was too far with respect to limits on the presidential removal authority, the same should apply here. The funding structure of the CFPB goes too far without having to answer or raise questions about other agencies. Granting federal agencies the authority to derive their funding from the Federal Reserve outside of the appropriations process is a dangerous precedent and is fundamentally inconsistent with the Constitution's separation of powers. The Federal Reserve seniorage from money creation is not a piggy bank. Forcing the Federal Reserve to pay for other government operations risks compromising the Fed's monetary policy independence. And for these reasons, I urge the Supreme Court of the United States to do the right thing, to vindicate the separation of powers, to uphold Congress's appropriations authority over federal executive branch agencies. And I urge my colleagues to remedy this constitutional defect, pass the Womack Appropriations Bill, pass the TABS Act, and restore congressional appropriations authority. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Barr, for your kind remarks and for your hard work in drafting the TABS Act. We are pleased to include it in this year's Financial Services General Government Appropriations Bill. Let me add that I fully agree with your assessment of the importance of making the CFPB part of the annual appropriations process. As you noted, most agencies are funded by Congress, including all the traditional consumer protection agencies, as you have articulated. I also agree with you that the purpose of this legislation is to uphold the Constitution. I mean, that is our oath. That's what we swear to on January 3rd every other year. This is a principled action. It is not an effort to kill the CFPB. That's why this bill funds the CFPB at the level it receives now. We merely want to create an accountable funding structure for the CFPB that is like all other consumer protection agencies. That's why I will not support the amendment to eliminate the funding. That's why constitutional principles, this is about the constitutional principles, not the CFPB's existence. Finally, let me say the Appropriations Committee has a critical constitutional responsibility to oversee how the federal government spends taxpayer dollars. The annual process is the mechanism whereby our democracy ensures that the people's priorities are reflected in how taxpayer dollars are allocated and spent. It's my hope the Supreme Court recognizes this fact and strikes down the funding structure of the CFPB.